Welcome back to this series on Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. In this episode, we're going to look at Chapter 4, which explores the relationship between faith and culture, and Dooyeweerd is developing his analysis of history and the role of faith in historical development and cultural activity. Dooyeweerd stresses that the Christian ground motive of creation, fall, and redemption makes a big difference in the way we understand the world around us and the way we understand reality. And Chapter 3 on history and Chapter 4 on faith and culture can be seen as a kind of demonstration of the difference that it makes when we begin with the creation motive in our analysis of these aspects of the world, history and faith. We often start by relating different aspects of creation in a dualistic way. We start by, say, distinguishing faith and reason, or between might and right, or between justice and nature. And then having separated them, we try and work out how to relate them back together. And we ask questions like, are they in conflict or harmony? Does one of the two have priority over the other? Or does one perhaps ultimately reduce to the other? Each of these questions and these problems are a result of the dialectical ground motives that have been so influential in Western culture. So by starting from the biblical ground motive of creation, fall and redemption, Dooyeweerd is able to break through this paralysis of thought. The creation motive, as we've been emphasizing, continually drives us to examine the inner nature, mutual relation, and coherence of all the aspects of God's created reality. So by starting off with a view of creation as expressing a rich diversity of modal aspects, of modes of being, which don't stand opposite each other and in conflict with each other, Dooyeweerd was able to develop an approach to analysis that sees each of the modal aspects as interdependent with others' aspects, as relating to each of the others in a mutually supporting and non-hierarchical way. It's important to appreciate and understand this approach to analysis because it's what makes Dooyeweerd's thought distinctive and unique, and this approach is more fundamental than any particular analysis that Dooyeweerd gives. So he writes on page 89, everywhere the ordinances of God, which obtain for the various aspects of created reality, display an indissoluble mutual coherence. For their root unity lies in the single religious commandment that we love God with all our heart. Here the creation order receives its integral character. So Dooyeweerd here is pointing to the root unity found in the commands to love God. This is the kind of spiritual urgency that underlies his analysis. This is where creation finds its integrity and what gives the creation motive its motivating power. So Dooyeweerd's analysis must always be seen for what it is. It's a fallible human attempt to understand the richness and coherence of God's creation and our tasks within it. The creation motive sets us on the right task. It liberates us from the false ways of thinking that's set up within the dualistic frame, but it never guarantees an error-free analysis. This point cannot be stressed enough. The approach is fundamental. The results are human and fallible. Naturally, to understand this method, it's helpful to see it in practice. And Dooyeweerd has been analysing history using this method. And at the start of this chapter, he rounds off this analysis, first of all, by looking at the link between history and law, saying, first of all, that they cannot be identified. But in political life, we can see how we find one kind of coherence between history and law, where the state cannot exist without establishing itself as the unique institution with the right to exercise administrative power over the public domain of a particular geographical territory. This power is achieved and guaranteed as a result of sin through what Dooyeweerd calls sword power. However, we need to understand that this exercise of power, which Dooyeweerd links to history and is therefore a historical achievement, is normatively limited by the inner nature of the state's task, which is to integrate the public domain on the basis of justice, so that the historical and the legal aspect find a unity and coherence in the role of the state. Then Dooyeweerd continues looking at history, and next he looks at its link with the moral aspect, pointing to what he calls a moral love of culture. This is where people pursue, say, art or science because of their love of art or science. And this love of culture is a strong resistance against the instrumentalization of cultural tasks, and so helps them maintain their authenticity. And finally, the historical process is guided by faith, which points us back to the ground motives that lead cultural activity and historical development. In order to give us a kind of full analysis of the relationship between faith and culture, Dooyeweerd now goes through an analysis of faith with its coherence with the other modal aspects, just as he did with history. Before he gets to that, though, he makes a couple of arguments about how we should think about faith. First of all, he argues that faith is a structural part of creation, and therefore it's something that's shared by all people. The difference between the Christian and the atheist, or the pagan, is not that one has faith and the other lacks faith. All people have faith. The difference then is the direction of that faith, whether faith is directed towards God or away from God, and therefore towards an idol, which is some aspect of creation that has replaced God's rightful position. This is different from what Dooyeweerd calls the scholastic view, where faith is something supernatural. It's something that's not part of the natural order of being human, but is added on to the Christian through God's grace as something in addition, so therefore above and beyond, therefore supernatural. A second point to understand is that Dooyeweerd views the modal aspects as having a certain order. Those lower down on the list are considered earlier and more foundational. The higher or the later modes build on the earlier ones, but they can also guide or deepen the earlier ones as the earlier modal aspects point forward towards the later ones. In his analysis of the faith aspect, Dooyeweerd speaks of analogies. This is where the meaning of faith points back to earlier aspects, and so he goes through the list in order. So in the adoration of God, faith points back to the moral aspect and our love of God. In God's right to be adored and God's justification of the righteous through faith, there is a reference to the juridical mode. Faith shows an analogy with the ascetic mode in the harmony through which humankind is brought into true communion with God. Note that each of these analogies are about faith. They're not about the moral, juridical and ascetic modes, but they reveal a link and therefore a kind of coherence with these modes. The sacrifice required by faith points to the economic mode, so too the idea of treasures in heaven. Our fellowship with other believers in the faith points to the social mode. The symbolism of faith and its truths written in the Bible point to the lingual mode. Dooyeweerd notes that the Bible can only be truly understood by faith. It is not merely a matter of textual analysis. The formation of faith, which is the particular responsibility of the Church, points to the historical mode. The progression from the Old Testament to the New Testament also points to the historical, while not for one moment contradicting the eternal truth that's revealed in the Bible for faith. There's also the spiritual discernment, which links to the logical mode, the security and firm trust of faith, which links to the psychical, the kind of emotional and sensory mode, and the life of faith, which has its need for nourishment in the word and the sacraments. Now, we could be quite tempted to view the modal aspects as quite static and quite structural, but remember that Dooyeweerd has the idea of creation as enclosing a whole series of potentialities which require human activity to disclose these possibilities and develop them. And so Dooyeweerd sees that each modal aspect can be in an either opened or closed condition. They are opened when the modal aspects and the possibilities within them are guided and opened up towards later modal aspects, whereas closed means that they only refer to earlier aspects. They haven't been developed yet. This leads Dooyeweerd to two problems. First of all, He asks the question, how can the aspect of faith be opened when there are no aspects that come later than the faith aspect? And the second problem is, how can historical development occur when it's guided by a faith that is closed? Something that Dooyeweerd says is obvious that it does happen, but how can that happen? His answer to the first question is that faith is opened or closed with respect to God's revelation. So when faith accepts and receives God's revelation, then it's open to it. When it refuses God's revelation and turns to idols, then it is closed with respect to God's revelation. His answer to the second question is that where faith is directed to an aspect that is earlier than the historical, in particular the biotic aspect, as with the Greek matter motive, there is no possibility of historical development. Where closed faith absolutizes a modal aspect from the historical or later, as with the Greek form motive, then historical development becomes a possibility. Dooyeweerd gives as an example of the first what he calls manna belief, which was being uncovered and understood by anthropologists at the beginning of the 20th century. And as an example of the second, as well as the Greek form motive, Dooyeweerd also points to ancient Egypt. With his analysis of history and faith and their interrelation complete, Dooyeweerd believes it is now possible to give an assessment of historical movements. He writes, "The norm of cultural differentiation holds that a true opening of culture is possible only when it unfolds itself into the differentiated spheres of the state, the church, science, art, industry, commerce, and so forth. This process of differentiation enables each societal sphere to reveal its own inner nature, and it allows each sphere to have its own sphere of power in history." So with this norm of cultural differentiation in place, Dooyeweerd is able to apply this to the Enlightenment as a cultural and historical movement. The bottom line judgment we must answer is the question, did the Enlightenment lead to a balanced development of the various cultural spheres, allowing each its due? The answer is no. The Enlightenment gave expression to an apostate faith that absolutized the cultural sphere of science as a tool to realize human freedom, autonomy through control of nature and even society. However, Dooyeweerd insists that a scriptural view of history is not narrow-minded. We shouldn't dismiss the Enlightenment just because it was controlled by an apostate faith. Instead, we need to look at the various cultural spheres and see that some benefited from the Enlightenment and some suffered. So that will give us the balanced assessment of the Enlightenment. Science, technology, and industry, for example, benefited significantly, as did the individual, with a recognition of greater individual rights, especially in freedom of speech and freedom of religion. This also significantly helped the development of the rule of law. So there's lots of positives that came out of the Enlightenment, and we should recognize that. On the negative side, though, because there's a disharmony in the development of culture, we see other aspects and other social spheres suffering. So ethics was reduced to utility, art suffered under a rationalistic classicism, and modernism was destructive of Christian faith wherever it gained a foothold in the churches. Also, economics was reduced to self-interest, and the Enlightenment's view of society led to a reduced view of social collectivity, such as the church, state, and family, which were denatured under what Dooyeweerd calls the dissolving impact of its individualism and rationalism. We can see in Dooyeweerd's analysis, working hand in hand, both the theme of the antithesis, with its emphasis on the opposition between the biblical ground motive and, in this case, the secular ground motive of the Enlightenment, and the theme of common grace, which focuses on the positive fruits of the Enlightenment. Dooyeweerd now ends this chapter with an appeal to Christians to recognize the antithesis and not be tempted to what he calls a middle-of-the-road stance, which is content to compromise with the reigning ground motive. Instead, the Christian ground motive transforms one's entire view of reality at its root. And appealing to Psalm 139, Dooyeweerd concludes, Human beings cannot sustain one atom of their existence before the Creator as their own property. Nowhere in all of creation can they find a certainty or refuge which might provide a hiding place for their sinful existence independent of God.